Welcome back to Face the Nation. More than 21 months after the attack on the U.S. Capitol, a trial against defendants charged with seditious conspiracy began here in Washington. New disclosures were presented to jurors in what prosecutors call one of the most important cases seeking accountability. CBS News congressional correspondent Scott MacFarlane has more.
A crime unlike any in the nation's history has led to a criminal trial unlike any in history. Stewart Rhodes, military vet, Yale law grad, and former congressional staffer, is founder of the far-right Oath Keepers group. Along with 4 co-defendants, he's standing trial for seditious conspiracy, accused of plotting to attack and block the peaceful transfer of power in America, and facing decades in prison if convicted. Former Justice Department attorney Michael Greenberger says no matter the outcome of the 6-week-long trial, history will be made.
This case is the most important seditious conspiracy case that was ever brought.
In the trial's opening days, prosecutors argued the group was plotting just days after the election. Jurors heard a clip of Rhodes from November 9, 2020, urging his group to be ready to fight to create a pathway to keep Trump in power.
I'm willing to sacrifice myself for that, but the fight starts there. Okay? Now, give President Trump what he needs, frankly.
Prosecutors showed an open letter written by Rhodes to then-President Trump, encouraging Trump to invoke the Insurrection Act to mobilize military veterans and militias and order a new election the militia would help administer. They played this interview clip of Rhodes for jurors.
We have men already stationed outside D.C. as a nuclear option.
Prosecutors argued the conspirators shared messages referencing civil war and predicting blood and violence. They said the group staged guns outside the D.C. limits and helped the execution of a military stack formation to breach the Capitol. For the Justice Department, which has gone to trial against approximately 20 January 6 defendants so far and won convictions in every case before a jury, the stakes here are higher. The Justice Department has limited experience going to trial on the charge of seditious conspiracy, but Greenberger says the trial itself could help avert a future attack.
Bringing the trial shows all these people out there think, oh, I'll go to Washington, I'll have a good time, it'll be fun, we'll break into the Capitol. No, you're going to end up, win or lose, convicted or not convicted, devoting a large part of your life and your fortune to defending yourself.
The trial resumes Tuesday, and the jurors ought to get comfortable. This could last all the way up to Thanksgiving. 6 to 7 weeks is the estimate.
Speaking of getting comfortable, we have a nice big full table here at Face the Nation. I want to welcome everyone. CBS News congressional correspondent Nicole Killion joins Scott MacFarlane. Also, we have New York Times chief White House correspondent Peter Baker and New Yorker staff writer Susan Glasser. Susan and Peter, I want to also let you know, are co-authors of a new book on the Trump presidency called The Divider. It's great to have you all with us. Susan and Peter, I want to start with you. To what degree did what you just saw with Kari Lake, who many in the Trump world regard as a fast-rising star, reinforce what you write about in The Divider?
Well, thank you very much, Major. I was really struck in your interview with her that the Trumpist style in American politics, a la the famous paranoid style in American politics, seems to be with us. Whether or not Trump himself is literally on the ballot, I think that Kari Lake is an example. First of all, she was rerunning a Trump play from the 2018 midterm elections, which did not work, by the way, in which he falsely claimed that there was an invasion at the southern border and actually sent real U.S. military troops to defeat this fake invasion. You have her and other candidates now using this language of invasion. I think we should point out, as a matter of fact, that we are not actually experiencing an invasion, number one. Number two, you have brazenness, I think, as a superpower. And so you have, for Donald Trump, right, he's willing to go anywhere, to say anything. And one thing he's found is that millions will follow him. For example, in the election lies about 2020. Interestingly, in your interview, she was not willing to actually come out and say that Joe Biden was not
what
the
Blake Masters said.
Absolutely.
Running for the Senate as a Republican in Arizona.
Even though they've all sought Trump's endorsement on the basis that they endorse his false claims. Very interesting. Does that mean that they can't quite fully imitate Donald Trump.
Peter, and yet, I think it's important to put the and yet. Kerry Lake is running neck and neck in Arizona. Donald Trump got millions more votes when he ran for re-election in 2020 and 2016. What does that tell you?
Yeah. Well, we call the book The Divider not because Trump created the divisions in our society, but he manifested them. He's the manifestation of them, and he figured out how to exploit them politically. And what we're now seeing is whether his inheritors, if you will, can then translate that same style, that same technique and approach on the state level in places like Arizona, Michigan, Wisconsin, and so forth. And the answer right now is they have a real strong support. It's a very evenly divided country. When you see these battleground states at 50-50, it tells you that the Trump part of the country is not just a minority. It's a significant part of America. And we have to confront that one way or the other. And it can't be dismissed. This is something that's going to outlast Trump himself.
Do you think that voters drawn to it are wrong to be drawn to it, or that is an acceptable alternative in American politics, and that there is something Democrats are missing about this particular approach?
Yeah, there's a politics of grievance, right? What Trump successfully tapped into is a sense out there of resentment among a lot of Americans who feel like the elites in some fashion or another have let them down, whether the elites be, in Washington or in their state capitals. It's also dividing, of course, along racial lines, along cultural lines, along ethnic and income lines. And it's been a successful trademark in this era. And the question is, how do you address those concerns in a way that doesn't exacerbate the divisions instead of bringing people together?
Nicole, you're on Capitol Hill, but you've also been traveling. What have you been seeing in relation to the things that Peter and Susan have been talking about? I know you were recently in Georgia. There's a Trump preferred candidate there. Had a very stressful week. Catch us up.
Well, that's right. And in terms of Herschel Walker, for now, the party seems to be standing with him. And so our voters are willing to look past his faults. But I think it's yet another example of, many voters being willing to accept anything. At one point in our races, the issue of candidate quality was something that meant a lot. But now you have candidates who deny elections, candidates who may have had past transgressions, and yet, voters are willing to look past that. So,
and in the case of the Georgia race, it's not just a transgression, it's something that fundamentally disagrees with what his position is, if I understand it correctly, on access to abortion.
Well, absolutely. This is somebody who has been staunchly anti-abortion, doesn't support abortion with exceptions, but yet these reports have started to come out that at one point in time, he paid for an abortion for a girlfriend, perhaps encouraged her to get an abortion on a second opportunity. And so that didn't happen. This woman claims to be the mother of his child. Again, CBS News has not been able to independently verify some of those claims, but it does raise questions about where he comes down on this issue. And this race is critical. I mean, this race could really decide control of the Senate. And so this is kind of a make or break moment for his campaign.
Scott, you watch the trials, the prosecutions resulting from January 6, 2021 very closely, but you also keep a very close eye on the atmospherics around the Capitol and the midterm elections itself. What is the sense of risk that members of Congress seeking re-election feel they are under, either at home or in the Capitol itself?
Significantly growing risk. In just a year's time, the Capitol Police have investigated thousands of potential threats against members of Congress. And then the Justice Department reveals that it has a task force that is also reviewing hundreds, if not thousands, of potential threats. And the political impact of this aside, and there may be a significant political impact to election denialism and questioning the integrity of elections, let's talk about the blocking and tackling of administering elections. It puts that at risk as well. You chronicled this well in your book. But I'll add, I talked to the elections administrator in Lansing, Michigan, Ingham County, Michigan, a purple county in Michigan, concerned about threats against her poll workers, concerned about recruiting poll workers, finding people to come in and want a piece of that. And we know that some of the administrators of elections nationwide are trying to recruit law students, American Bar Association-related volunteers, somebody to come man the polls in this uniquely toxic environment.
Toxic environment, Susan, does that feel like something that will be inevitable, not only in this midterm election, it's not going to go away, clearly we know that. Will this toxicity, should we assume it will continue all the way up to 2024, possibly beyond?
Yeah, I think it's not just a matter of rhetoric, right? It's, structural changes that are being made in our politics. You have Trump, who's reoriented the Republican Party and radicalized it. The Washington Post reported this week that 299 nominees, Republican nominees for House, Senate, and major statewide posts are election deniers, including in some will be in key races where they are determining the counting and the certification of votes going forward. And by the way, many of those Republican nominees are in safe Republican seats, so they're now guaranteed to have essentially a wave of Trumpian shock troops who have made election denialism a foundation of the Republican Party's new ideology. So it's not just a matter of rhetoric. I think we're changing the structure of American politics in ways that are designed to exacerbate this ongoing crisis in American democracy.
Nicole, it's pretty clear if you look at the spending patterns in some of the Senate races, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, dramatic examples of this. On the Republican side, more than half of the money spent on TV advertising is about crime. To what degree do you see that playing as a potentially pivotal issue in the midterms?
Well, it certainly is a Republican talking point and an issue that they want to put front and center. I was just in Wisconsin over the weekend and talked to Senator Johnson, who is going for his third term, and he did say that he feels that that should be a defining issue in this election. On the flip side, though, in terms of his opponent, he has tried to paint him as someone who is soft on crime, but in terms of Mandela Barnes, his approach has really been making this abortion rights issue, which we have seen Democrats time and again in a lot of these Senate races really try to bring that to the fore. So, again, kind of as Anthony pointed out earlier, I think it's, each party has a different narrative, and it's a matter of which one is going to rise to the top.
Peter, in your book with Susan, do you deduce anything that you think is of lasting and positive value from the Trump years?
Well, look, I think it's reinforced this conversation about what our democracy is and should be, right? And it's forced us to look at the structure, as Susan said, of our politics and of our system. But I think that what the concern is, we don't know where it's going to lead us. Do we reaffirm our commitment to this system that we created 240 years ago, or are we going to find ourselves lost? And I think that that's the big question heading into 2024.
I mean, if the former president were sitting here, he said, I'd improved the economy, I made American foreign policy stronger. Would you say any of that has a validity based on all the research that went into the book?
There are a lot of voters out there who say, look, I like Donald Trump because I like some of the things he accomplished. He did like tax cuts or a conservative Supreme Court justice or regulation cuts or what have you. But the question that's raised, at least certainly in our book, goes beyond a specific Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative ideological fight. It goes to the larger questions of what we want to be as a country. And I think that's what makes Trump unique. He's not like other Republicans or Democrats. It's not about policy. It's not about where health care should be or tax cuts. It's about whether you believe in the system that we created.
It is a time for uniqueness and larger questions, to be sure. Peter Baker, Susan Glasser, Nicole Killion, Scott MacFarlane, thank you so very much. We'll be right back. As Russia's military suffers more setbacks in its invasion of Ukraine, President Biden warned last week that Russian President Vladimir Putin is, quote, not joking, unquote, when he talks about using nuclear weapons, saying we face a prospect of nuclear Armageddon unlike anything we have seen since the height of the Cold War. For more on what's happening on the ground in Ukraine, CBS News senior foreign correspondent Charlie D'Agata has more.
In a serious escalation to the war here, security cameras captured the moment a massive explosion tore through the Crimean Bridge on Saturday morning. Russian officials blame the explosion on a truck bomb, calling it an act of terror. It comes on the back of a series of setbacks on the battlefields. Ukrainian forces have been clawing back territory on multiple fronts in the south toward Kherson and east in the Donbass region, where we traveled to the liberated city of Lyman. On the way, we spoke with Colonel Serhiy Cherevati, who took part in the battle.
Which weapons were important in this fight?
Artillery was very important, he said. American weapons and, of course, the HIMARS. The high-mobility artillery rocket systems that can strike targets deep behind enemy lines. But every inch of ground retaken in the very territory President Putin has illegally annexed risks retaliation and deepens the specter of a nuclear response. And in an interview with the BBC, President Zelensky has warned Russia may be getting ready.
They begin to prepare their society. That is very dangerous.
Once again this week, the Russian military showed a reckless disregard for human life. Overnight, rockets rained down on a residential neighborhood in Zaporizhia, leveling apartment blocks, killing more civilians. The latest in a series of strikes. Earlier this week on a grand avenue in Zaporizhia, we found firefighters still dousing a mountain of twisted metal and concrete.
Several hours after the rocket attack, and the building is still smoldering. This is no longer a rescue operation. And this is in an upmarket neighborhood in the center of town.
The more Russian troops lose against Ukrainian soldiers, the more they retaliate against civilians.
Renewed shelling at the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant has cut the main power lines there. Engineers have had to rely on emergency diesel generators. President Putin has signed a decree declaring that it's now officially under Russian ownership. Major?
Charlie, thank you. We'll be back in a moment. We turn now to America's economic challenges. And to help us out, I want to bring in Mohammed El-Erian. He is the chief economic advisor at financial services company Allianz. He is also president of Queen's College in Cambridge. He's good enough to join us this morning from New York. So this week was a very volatile week in the U.S. stock markets. Volatility has been ever present, I would say, during this calendar year, but this week seemed really volatile. For our audience, break it down. What's going on? What is the source, if you can identify it, of that volatility?
So the main source of this volatility is changing perceptions of the Federal Reserve. We are in this incredible situation, Major, where good news for the economy is bad news for the markets. And that's because the markets are worried that the Federal Reserve will tip us into recession by overreacting to strong economic news.
Every White House I've ever covered, and it's been more than one or two, has said, you know, the markets isn't the economy. The economy is the economy. And what markets do, markets are going to do. Even so, volatility affects people's retirement, their planning, and their sense of their medium and long-term futures. How should people be looking at that? And when they hear the president, as he did on Friday, talk about navigating this transition, what does that mean?
So first, there's volatility and there's unsettling volatility. Volatility when things go up and down, and on the whole, you're better off over time. But that's not what we've had this year. We've had unsettling volatility because we've had the stock market down by anything from 20 to 30%. We've had bonds, which are supposed to safeguard your investment, also down by about 15%. So there's been nowhere to hide. That's why people feel insecure. That's why they look at their retirement plans with concern. The president is right. We are currently on what I think of as a bumpy journey to a better destination. And we need to navigate both the journey and get ready for the destination. There is a possibility that the Federal Reserve makes another mistake and that bumpy journey actually changes the destination. That's why the markets are on edge.
Is it your perspective that the Federal Reserve has already made a series of mistakes, either not acting fast enough or overreacting?
So it's made two big mistakes that I think are going to go down in the history books. One is mischaracterizing inflation as transitory. By that, they meant it is temporary, it's reversible, don't worry about it. That was mistake number one. And then mistake number two, when they finally recognized that inflation was persistent and high, they didn't act. They didn't act in a meaningful way. And as a result, we risk mistake number three, which is by not easing their foot off the accelerator last year, they are slamming on the brakes this year, which will tip us into recession. So yes, unfortunately, this will go down as a big policy error by the Federal Reserve.
Continuing your metaphor, slamming on the brakes, does that mean it is impossible to achieve the either literal or mythical soft landing?
Even Chair Powell has gone from looking for a soft landing to a softish landing to now talking about pain. And that is the problem. That is the cost of a Federal Reserve being late. Not only does it have to overcome inflation, but it has to restore its credibility. So yes, I fear that we risk a very high probability of a damaging recession that was totally avoidable, Major.
Washington, D.C. is a hyper-political town. not a news bulletin, so it tends to absorb information internationally, sometimes in personal ways. So there was a lot of chatter this week that when OPEC Plus decided and announced it was cutting production, that was against President Biden specifically. Do you agree with that, or do you think it's a broader OPEC Plus declaration about the direction of the global economy?
So first, it does hurt the U.S., and we've seen oil prices go up above $90 a barrel. What does that mean? It means that inflation, which has been coming down, now risks going up again. So that is not good for us. However, that it came as a surprise, it didn't come as a surprise to me. OPEC is looking to protect oil prices in the context of declining global demand. All three major areas in the world, China, Europe, and the US, are slowing much faster, which means less demand for oil. So what does OPEC do? They cut back supply. So this shouldn't have come as a big surprise. That's what they do. That's their history. But it's certainly not good news for the U.S. economy.
Tying these things together, do you think higher gasoline prices inevitably mean higher inflation, making all the things we've discussed more complicated? And do you have a consumer price index prediction for the near future?
So the next measure comes out in a few days. That's going to be for September. Headline inflation will probably come down to about 8%. But core inflation, what measures the drivers of inflation and how broad they are, is still going up. So we still have an inflation issue. Inflation will come down, Major. The question is, does it come down with a slowdown in the economy or a major recession? That is the question that's being debated right now. It's not whether we'll have inflation coming down. We will, but it's the cost of that inflation coming down.
Is the jobs report this week a silver lining in all of this otherwise gloomy assessment?
It certainly is. We created 263,000 jobs. That's a lot for this stage. We also reduced the unemployment rate to 3.5%. That's really low. There was one concern, which is that labor force participation, how many people are in the labor force, came down. And that's not good news. And it talks to the importance of focusing on human capital.
One last thing before I let you go. We have about 30 seconds. About 2 or 3 months ago, it was common for people on the web to see stagflation headlines. We are not in a stagflation situation.
We are. Growth is coming down. Inflation is still high. Unfortunately, it's not time to eliminate that term yet.
Very good. Mohammed El-Erian, we thank you so much for your time, and we will be right back. Well, that is it for us today. We want to thank you for watching. Margaret will be back next week. For Face the Nation, I'm Major Garrett.